This morning we're going to continue our conversation about love that we started last week, last couple weeks really, and dig a little more into the way that love is defined in 1 Corinthians 13, a chapter of the Bible that whether you've been a person that's gone to church all your life or have never stepped foot into a church before, there's a good chance you've heard portions of this read at things like weddings and other places because of the beauty of the language that's used to describe this thing called love. And if you're here this morning and you wouldn't identify yourself as a Christian, and you're here today for whatever it is that brought you here, I'm really glad that you're here, because you may be one like so many in the world that when they think about Christians and Christianity, they actually have kind of a negative opinion, and sometimes would even describe, if given the opportunity, to describe Christians as being people that just don't seem to come off as very loving people, or that Christianity as a religion doesn't seem to be a very loving kind of religious expression. And like I said last week, that's so unfortunate. And so if that's you and that's kind of been your opinion because you haven't had the opportunity to know a Christian that's really demonstrated in real and tangible ways the definitions of love, then I want for you at least to be able to hear the ideal of what it is that we're going after, regardless of how much we may actually fall short of living up to this. And if you are a Christian, then it is absolutely essential that as we dig into what the Bible has to say about love, that we take to heart how God defines for us this thing called love. Now, if I get through the message today and you say, regarding all of the various descriptions of love, that you can check all those boxes, well, then you need to listen to last week's. Right? Because last week we took up about half of them, and maybe if you're getting a perfect score in all the things we talk about today, it must be last week's message that you really need to hear, that might help you to understand where gaps or weaknesses may be in this love that we are called to live. We talked about how love is not something that we should consider to be this feeling, right? Love is not this thing that we're trying to drum up inside of us. It's not the idea of possessing certain feelings and attitudes towards someone else, and that like somehow we have to develop those feelings until they get to a place where we could describe them as love. But rather, love is action. Like very simply stated, love is not dependent upon the way we feel. Love is expressed through the way we act toward one another. And so let me read for you again 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7. And again, some of these we have already talked about, but we'll pick up where we left off last week. Paul says, love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, is not boastful, is not arrogant, is not rude, is not self-seeking, is not irritable, and does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So picking up where we left off last week, let's talk about how Paul defines love as being something that is not rude. Love is not rude. What Paul means here is that love does not behave in such a way that it goes against what is commonly accepted as the standard of acceptable behavior. How many of you think you have a pretty firm grip on what is acceptable behavior? Right? Most of us. That is, given the various contexts you may find yourself in, there's a certain way that we understand we ought to behave ourselves, and that there are certain kinds of behaviors that are outside what is commonly accepted in the civil order of things, right? And you may not be able to see when you're deviating from those, but you can certainly see when other people are not, right? When other people have decided that they're going to act in a way that is like, it's just outside of what everybody else in the area would probably define as acceptable. So this means that love does not act disgracefully or indecently. I put it this way: love, in a positive sense, in the way that it acts, it takes the feelings and sensitivities of others into consideration. Like when you think about love is not rude, what we're really saying is that love, in the company of other people, it takes into consideration the thoughts and the sensitivities of others, right? Like this is why it doesn't allow oneself to kind of move beyond the limits of what is accepted, because it cares about how other people feel or what other people think, right? Like the way that I act is not, well, I'm gonna just be me, and I'm gonna act however I want to act because I'm free to be me, right? We know that is a virtue that is widely becoming adopted in our world, in our society today, right? That, hey, just you be you and don't worry about what other people think. Well, love says, well, I don't really want to operate that way. Like, I actually want to take into consideration the thoughts, the feelings, and the sensitivities of others, right? So you've been in a place where you know that another person has not taken into consideration. Maybe it was your thoughts or your sensitivities, and you knew how that made you feel, right? And so it is with us. Like if we're going to actually practice love toward one another, like I got to think about, I have to be attuned to who I may be affecting with the way that I talk, with the way that I act. Love is not rude. It takes the feelings of others into consideration. It takes the thoughts and feelings of people into consideration when they're in the room, and also even when they're not in the room, right? That is, we have to be careful even how we act and talk when we think that, this person isn't here, and so now I'm just free to kind of talk or act however I want, right? Love considers the feelings and sensitivities of others. Love is not rude. Paul goes on to say that love is not self-seeking. Again, these are all we might describe as kind of negations. This is what love is not. Love is not self-seeking. So the opposite would mean something like to be unloving is to be seeking one's own benefit. But love, according to Paul, doesn't go around trying to find something for itself. Now, this is a real challenge for us, right? Because our inclination, our natural inclination, is to go around looking for what benefits us, like what benefits me, what benefits ourselves. But love avoids this constant wandering and going around trying to find something for oneself. It resists asking and looking for the answer to the question, well, what can I gain for myself? Right? It doesn't see the interactions that we have with one another as being transactional. That is, okay, well, if we are going to enter into this thing, what do I stand to benefit? You know how, or could you see how sometimes you do that, right? What is the quid pro quo here? What is the tit for tat? Like, how are we going to enter into a mutual or an equal exchange with one another when it comes to whatever the matter happens to be? See, love doesn't do that. Love it's just not interested in ultimately summing up the equation into a result that nets positive for me. Like, what do I get out of this? How am I benefiting from this? Love doesn't do that. Love also avoids the tendency that we have to want to justify ourselves with with our behavior, how we go about living our lives. You see, one of the things that we have to wrestle against, that I think Jesus really brought into and made very, very clear to us, is we wonder, well, how many of you want to be selfish people? Nobody? All right. Don't raise your hands, but how many of you are selfish? Right? That's probably lots of us. But we don't want to be selfish. Correct? So what we do sometimes with that is, well, and we don't actually write this down, right, because we'd be embarrassed to do so. But we work in our minds this, well, how little can I do for others so that I wouldn't be described as selfish? Like, where's that line that differentiates between being selfish and being unselfish? Where's that line? Because I want to, I don't want to go overboard with unselfishness, right? I mean, somebody's got to look out for numero uno here. Right? And if it's not me, who's it going to be? So what does it take for me to live in a way that will widely be regarded by others as being unselfish? How little can I do? There was a man that interacted with Jesus in discussing some of the kingdom ethics. And he asked Jesus this follow-up question. He said, well, who's my neighbor? Right? Jesus leaves them with, love your neighbor as yourself, right? Go and do that. Go and love your neighbor as you love yourself, and you will, in essence, fulfill all of the law, all of what God requires of you. And so when the story is told by Luke, he says that this man, he kind of gets into his heart. He says, this man wanting to justify himself, he says to Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? And we take that to mean, all right, well, if the requirement that I'm supposed to live according to is to love my neighbor, then, well, who's my neighbor? Like, how would you define my neighbor? Where is that line? How do I know where I can stop loving, a person as I love myself? How do I understand who that person is? And of course, Jesus tells this great story that many of us are familiar with about the Good Samaritan, right? This one who didn't have any regard for either how far away he was from a person who he came upon that was in need. It didn't matter from an ethnic standpoint how far away he was from him, from a cultural standpoint how far away from him he was, right? The fact that his people and their people were not very fond of one another, like those things just didn't play into the fact that a man came upon somebody who was in need and he went and helped him. Right? And Jesus says, like, this is what you need to do for others, right? And so there ultimately we understand that to be, there's no limits to who we would understand to be our neighbor. And so when we say that love is not self-seeking, we might say it this way. Love won't tolerate for someone else what it wouldn't tolerate for itself. Love won't tolerate for someone else what it wouldn't tolerate for itself. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, what the Samaritan who came upon this person who had been beaten and left for dead, what he wouldn't tolerate for himself would be to be left there, ignored, and left for dead. Like, he wouldn't have tolerated that for himself, and so he was unwilling to tolerate that for this other person who was in need. I think this is why from time to time when the Bible talks about things like what pure religion looks like, it says things like that pure religion, like the purest form of religion, is to care for the widow and the orphan. Like, why does it say that? Well, it recognizes that there are these categories of people that kind of live in the margins who oftentimes are very vulnerable to the world, right? The widows of ancient times, often left without the means of providing for and taking care of themselves. They were very, very vulnerable to the world in which they lived. Orphans, those who are without parents, obviously, we understand the kind of vulnerability that creates in the life of a person who's not yet of age to care for himself or herself. And so pure religion is this, to care for the widow and orphan. That is to not tolerate for the widow what one would not tolerate for oneself. Right? To understand that the situation an orphan finds himself or herself in, a person comes along and sees that and says, I wouldn't tolerate those circumstances for myself, and so I'm not willing to tolerate those circumstances for this person. Jesus in, I believe, Matthew chapter 25, he talks about this judgment where everybody stands before God, the great judge. And his judgment is determined based upon how people have acted, how people have lived in this life, right? He says to the one half, he says, when I was hungry, you fed me. And when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick or imprisoned, you came and visited to me. And he says to the other half the exact opposite. When I was hungry, you did not feed me. When I was thirsty, you didn't give me something to drink. When I was naked, you didn't clothe me. When I was sick or in prison, you didn't come and visit me. And so Jesus here, he is illustrating the reality of like the way that we live our lives with regard to the people around us and in our world. That matters. Like how we act, how we're willing to act on someone's behalf, it matters. That you and I, rather than seeking to justify ourselves when we happen to come across a particular need that someone else has, right, of just sort of turning a blind eye to that or pretending that it doesn't exist, I have to ask myself, well, when I'm hungry, do I tolerate my own starvation? Like, do I do that? Do you do that? No, you go into the pantry and you get something to eat, right? Or you say, hey, let's go out, and you go to a restaurant and you order something. We wouldn't tolerate starvation for ourselves. We wouldn't allow that to happen to ourselves. And so if that's true of how we would treat ourselves, then to not be self-seeking means, well, I'm not going to tolerate starvation for somebody else. If I'm thirsty, do I tolerate dying of thirst? No, I don't tolerate that for myself. You don't tolerate that for yourself. If I were thirsty, would I tolerate that the only water I have access to comes from this infected water supply, like full of germs and all this other kind of microbiology that is going to have a really bad effect on me? Like, would I tolerate that? Would I put up with that? I don't know about you. You get the water report from the town that you live in. You're like, what do all these numbers mean, right? You start washing your clothes and everything's coming out rusty and brown, right? I don't know about you, but I wouldn't tolerate that, right? Would I tolerate it for somebody else? Would I be willing to just sort of ignore that reality for someone else? Love is not self-seeking. Next, Paul says, love is not irritable. Love is not irritable. Again, don't raise your hands, but how many of you are easily irritated? Yeah, you couldn't help yourself, right? It's like, I know you said don't raise your hands. I got to own this, right? I got to own this before the Lord this morning. Love is not irritable. What Paul's talking about here is the tendency that we have to have the inward part of us aroused to anger. And what's interesting about being irritable is that it often has nothing to do with other people. Like, we think that our irritableness, it's the fault of the people around us, right? The people you live with. Can I get an amen? Right? I wouldn't be irritable if it weren't for her or for him or for them, right? It's the fault of the people around us. But often, really, It has nothing to do with other people. It has more to do with how self-absorbed we are. Where does that irritableness come from? It comes from the reality that I am full of myself. I am so self-absorbed that I become something like a sponge, and everything around me presses in. You ever been described as the kind of person where, like things come on you and it just rolls off you like water off a duck's back, right? To be self-absorbed is sort of the opposite of that. It doesn't have the ability to deflect the various things that happen to us. Instead, it just absorbs it. This kind of person is often suspicious of others and paranoid, right? This constantly feeling these feelings toward others. It's like they're trying to irritate me. They're trying to annoy me. They have ulterior motives. There's this paranoia that sets in about other people, and it is absolutely destructive with our ability to relate with one another in a healthy way, because everything becomes personal, right? And we're so self-absorbed that everything that's going on around us, it feels like it's directed toward us, and a lot of times has nothing to do with you. And so I think every once in a while we just need to be reminded, listen, not everything is about you. What may be going on around you, the way that you took another person's words, you took it like a sponge, you sucked them in. And if you actually knew what was going on when those words were being spoken, it had nothing to do with you, right? But you don't possess the ability to necessarily separate that, right? Because you've become too self-absorbed, right? I know that I have to be careful, and some of you probably say and echo this. It's like, yeah, I got to be careful not to become so self-absorbed that I don't have the ability to deflect. Love creates, and it's not like, well, I'm just going to create a wall, right? And I'm gonna try to separate myself from my feelings and compartmentalize things so that when something happens, I just don't feel it, right? That's an unhealthy thing to do. Just create these false walls. But what real love does is it works as a sort of armor around us in the healthiest way you can possibly imagine it. Again, not this unhealthy wall that just sucks it in and then keeps it in, right? Love is not irritable, right? With that, you're living with the irritation inside. But love does have the ability to deflect, to not just simply absorb everything. And so love here, it doesn't let us put ourselves into a state of anger. We think that, well, if I can keep the anger that I'm feeling invisible toward the other person or toward other people, then, well, I've done it, right? I have followed in the way of Jesus. I'm raging inside, but it all stayed inside. And so nobody's the worse off. But Paul's he's getting into our hearts here. Love is not, it's not only concerned with how we act physically, exteriorly toward one another, but how we act toward one another in our hearts. What are my feelings toward this other person? What's in my heart with regard to this other person? Love, let me say it this way, love doesn't leave another person feeling like they're always walking on eggshells, unsure of when things are going to blow up. Love is not irritable. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Can we all just let out a big sigh here? Love keeps no record of wrongs. How many of you know Sharon, our executive administrator, sitting right over there if you don't? Hi, Sharon. So Magnus, our youth pastor, he keeps a book. He keeps a book of all the things that Sharon has said. Now, if you know Sharon, she is rarely, if ever, wrong. Right, Sharon? Right, Peter? But like every once in a while she is wrong, and Magnus keeps a record. It's dated. It's something that we can go back to. We want to keep a record because, well, let's be honest. If we keep a record, someday that record just might come in handy. Right? Like, okay, well, I don't need to use this right now. But there may be a time in the future where I need this. So love doesn't keep records for a rainy day. I think I've shared this before. I'm not really a hoarder, except when it comes to cables. Anybody needs a cable for anything, you come and see me, because I probably have. Like, I don't throw away cables, right? Because, you throw away that weird cable that connects some of your digital devices, and as soon as you throw it away, guess what? You're going to need it, right? So love doesn't do that. It doesn't save the record for a rainy day. It's like, you know how sometimes before a trial for somebody that has been arraigned, the judge will hear certain arguments for the kind of evidence that the lawyers want to bring into the trial. And sometimes the judge decides that there's certain evidence that won't be allowed into the trial. Sometimes the judge will even say regarding the person that's being accused of something that a prior conviction will not be allowed into that particular trial. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Perhaps you can see, or maybe even imagine how God does this for us. Like, doesn't that beautifully describe the kind of love that God demonstrates for us? A love that keeps no record of wrongs. Like, when it comes to the wrongdoings of you and me, because of what Jesus has accomplished for us on our behalf, our sin is described as being removed from God as far as the east is from the west. That God doesn't just drum up, every once in a while when he gets a little annoyed with us or needs some material against us. He doesn't go back into the past and say, you remember when you did that? Remember the other day when you, love keeps no record of wrongs. Then Paul says, love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. You ever wonder why a brother or sister, like if you've had any siblings, maybe you've experienced this. Why is it that a brother or sister can find happiness when his or her sibling does something wrong and gets in trouble, right? It's interesting and sad how another person's failure sometimes gives us reason to be proud of ourselves. And so we have to ask ourselves, do I have a tendency to relish in someone else's pain? When I hear what has happened to another person, whether it's a stranger or more often a person maybe with whom I am acquainted that maybe has done a little better than I've done, has accomplished a little more than I've accomplished, seems to have just kind of been able to fly their balloon a little higher than everybody else. Isn't it nice every once in a while to just see them kind of brought back down to earth a little bit? Why is that? I mean, would you agree with me about, like, we've all held those feelings, and it's so ugly. Like having the feeling, even just like this little bit of joy that comes at the expense of another person's failure. Oh, what an ugly, gross, awful thing. We'd never want to admit it. We'd never want for anybody to be able to see that up on the big screen of our lives, that we took some delight in another person's failure. But instead, Paul says love delights in what is sound and real and true. And so here's what love does. When love comes across the misfortune of another person, the pain, the suffering, or the failure even of another person, here's what love does. Either love wants to celebrate with somebody or love wants to help. Like when somebody's experiencing the thing that is good, then love comes around and wants to celebrate that goodness. And when the story goes the other way, instead of love reveling in that other person's misfortune and failure, love rushes in to help. Paul says, and he closes out this part of his description of love, he says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Unfortunately, a lot of times we hear something like that, we think that love is this thing that just becomes all-inclusive. Like if you've ever gone on an all-inclusive vacation, the idea is that you just kind of pay this price and you go on vacation and then everything's included. It's just all, like everything is there. And that's not actually really, I think, what Paul is trying to get at. The idea that Christianity just sort of includes and embraces all things without any real discernment or discretion or judgment. It's given people like Michel Foucault the opportunity to describe Christianity as requiring people to be docile and conforming. Right? That he would, from a philosophical standpoint, look at Christians, broadly speaking, and say, well, this is a bunch of people that the institution of religion has come and required to just simply sit docile and conform to what it is that they are being fed. Karl Marx described Christianity as an opium for the masses. That is, and maybe you've heard it this way, that religion is like a crutch for those who are weak-minded. Sigmund Freud described Christianity as a way for us to deal with the inner conflicts that we're feeling through the power of wishful feeling. That is, we all have these disconnects with the way things are and the way things ought to be, and so we adopt some form of religion so that, like, if we can get to this place where we can believe all things, then we can also then endure all things. But that's not what Paul was describing. Paul was not describing love as just being this all-inclusive kind of thing. Rather, when he says, again, 4 times that love does these things toward all things, that bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, what he's really saying here is that love has no limits. Love has no limits. There's no limit to where love can go. When it comes to like real, raw Christianity, it is anything but docile. It is anything but non-intellectual. It is anything but conformist or mediocre. That Christianity does not thrive on the masses being willing to come and sit in seats and just listen and digest whatever is spoon-fed to them without any thinking or rationalizing about what it is that they're hearing. Our church is one that believes in the power of transformation that comes with us being able to individually and corporately wrestle with things that are being talked about. If you're interested in resources, there's a podcast I love listening to called The Unbelievable Podcast, which generally pits 2 people against one another to have a conversation on some particular topic, and it's just absolutely wonderful. Like, instead of people like yelling and screaming at one another, it's usually done in a very civil and orderly way. But I mean, it's for real, and so you'll have a person arguing for what might be a particular Christian persuasion, and another person that is countering those arguments. And like, I'd encourage everybody to listen to those kinds of things, and then like work in your own mind and in your own thoughts. Like, how do I actually understand what it is that I'm hearing? I think that there's a little more of an obscure version of the Bible called the Revised English Bible. It translates these 4 things this way. It says, there's nothing love cannot face. There's no limit to its faith, no limit to its hope, no limit to its endurance. That is, love, when it says that love believes all things, that does not mean that it chooses to believe the best about people. Like, sometimes we talk about, well, I just choose to believe the best about somebody else. You know what that is? That's looking at others or looking at things through rose-colored glasses. That's not a good thing to do. See, what love actually is able to do is with keen discernment and not through rose-colored glasses, it can look at things as they really are and yet doesn't lose faith. Now, that's something. That means if you love me, you can see me for how I really am. Like you don't have to create some kind of caricature of who you hope I may one day be. You actually get to see who I really am with all the warts and the pimples, with all the weaknesses and all the failures, and you can say, I still love you. That's something. Right? You take two people who have fallen romantically in love with one another and just are head over heels, enraptured with one another. We would describe their love as blind, right? Like they can't even see the warts and the pimples, but they just are so madly in love with one another. That's not what Paul's talking about. Paul doesn't mean like, we're going to just ride this wave of love and we're going to just believe for No, when Paul says love believes all things, love hopes all things, it says, I see things for how they are, and yet my love will endure. That's why it can endure, right? Because it has a confidence in the future, and so it can be tenacious in the way that it is love now. So let me close with this. How do we do this? So we talk about love. How can we do this? How do I get help for becoming more loving as a person? For a lot of us, they didn't teach us this at home. This wasn't modeled for us when we were growing up. They didn't teach us this in school. And so let me just tell you that if we're going to really embrace this radical form of love, it starts with a relationship with Jesus. It starts with an experience with him. Because as we enter into this relationship with Jesus and we begin to do as he commanded, which is to follow him, that is, we walk alongside him, we learn from him, we hear his teaching, we start to wash over ourselves with the teachings and the ways of Jesus. And we start to find ourselves becoming more like him as we better understand the way that God has lavished his love toward us. 1 John 4:7-8 says, Dear friends, let us love one another because love is from God. And everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God. Why? Because God is love. God has demonstrated for us in no uncertain terms his incredible love for us. Whenever we think about the love of God, we can go right down the list of 1 Corinthians 13 and we can see all the many ways that the prism of love, the way in which it is defined, reflects the character of God and his love for us. And you know what you and I are required to do is to seek how we can express that form of love, genuine love toward one another.